and insightful questions. If this is your first Socratic Club event, welcome and thank you for joining us. We hope you attend more debates in the future. The OSU Socratic Club organizes religious debates and dialogues between scholars for the benefit of OSU and the surrounding community. The club was first founded in 1941 at Oxford University, with C.S. Lewis serving as its first president. The club was first founded in 1941. Just read that. Our mission is to provide an open forum for the discussion of intellectual difficulties connected with religion and with Christianity in particular. More information on the club and some free essays are available in the lobby. Please feel free to stop by and talk to any of us after tonight's debate. Our Facebook is another great resource for information and also includes a link to our YouTube channel, which features videos of many previous debates. The goal of tonight's debate is to analyze the relationship between Christianity and environmental stewardship. Specifically, our speakers will address the question, is Christianity a help or hindrance into sound environmental stewardship? The structure of tonight's debate is as follows. Each speaker will be given 25 minutes to speak in defense of his chosen position. Next, there will be 20 minutes of discussion, during which the speakers may give questions of one another. Questions will then be taken from the audience for about 35 minutes. Those 35 minutes tend to pass quickly, so I suggest forming your questions carefully and perhaps writing them down in the space provided in your programs during the debate. We will try to close by 9 o'clock with a 3 to 5 minute closing statement from each speaker. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lauren Wilkinson. Dr. Wilkinson is a professor of interdisciplinary studies and philosophy at Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he has been on faculty since 1981. His teaching interests include Christianity and the arts, philosophy, and earthkeeping. In the course of his career, Dr. Wilkinson has published both popular and scholarly articles on a wide range of topics, including Christian environmental ethics and the environmental, scientific, and religious aspects of the human relationship with the natural world. His books include Earthkeeping, Christian Stewardship of Natural Resources, and Caring for Creation in Your Own Backyard, a book he co-authored with his wife. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Wilkinson.
I'm great. I have not yet turned my machine on. Yes. I'm very grateful to the Socratic Club for inviting me down here from Canada tonight to talk about this hugely important topic. And that's not, for me, just a conventionally polite introduction. I grew up, because in a deep sense, when I'm coming here, I'm coming home. I grew up on a farm along the Saint River, which flows into the Willamette, a few miles north of here, as you know. I went to high school in Albany. Corvallis was our most serious rival back then. I came here a lot for track and cross-country meets and speech and debate tournaments. So it's a privilege to come back to Corvallis and Oregon State more than half a century later. But I mentioned that boyhood along the Saint River for a reason more relevant to our conversation tonight. And that conversation concerns the sources that we draw on as we think about our treatment of the earth. When I try to identify those sources in my own life, two influences stand out. One is being born into a Christian family, growing up thoroughly shaped by the broad outlines of the Christian story. That we live in a universe which is the good gift of a loving Creator God. That the clearest picture we have of that Creator is through the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I'll return to that story and its implications for our relationship to the earth in a little while. But as I said, that story, and when I use the word story, I don't mean story as opposed to something that's true, but a true story, a narrative in which our life can find its meaning. That story's informed my thinking and my writing and my teaching about the care of creation. And I believe it provides the solidest foundations for our actions towards the earth. But that relevance of Christianity for Our life on the earth wasn't very obvious to me then. So that first central influence from my childhood was pretty disconnected from that other main influence, which was the place itself, that farm and forest I grew up in along the Santa Ana River. Among my earliest memories are wandering on deer trails through that still intact ecosystem. But also among those earliest memories are following my father down into the woods behind our old decrepit Alice Chalmers Caterpillar tractor on homemade logging roads. I come from a family of loggers. Our business was to work hard, cutting down the forest, and turning it into fields. I grew up in a pioneer culture. Oregon is, or at least was when I was a boy, a state which glorifies the pioneer experience. Have you ever looked closely at that golden figure on top of the state capitol in Oregon, in Salem? It's a muscular pioneer, astride a stump, holding an axe. The last of the old-growth Douglas fir on our family's farm was finally cut down to help pay for my college education. And at college, near Chicago, a long way from Oregon, I began to get a bigger view of creation, began to appreciate it, the processes that had produced the mountains and the forests that I loved, the complexity of the relationships of living things to each other and to their place. I began to see that what we call evolution was not opposed to creation by a living God, but a way of describing the slow action of God in shaping the biosphere. And I began to connect those two stories, the Hebrew and Christian story, told in the Bible in terms of older science and cosmology, and the new story of creation being unfolded by science, and to see them as part of the same story. And I want to be clear that when I use the word creation, as I'm going to, as a synonym for nature or the environment, I'm not assuming the cosmology of the ancient, which was the framework for that poetic six-day story of creation in Genesis 1. But the thing that that account is saying about the relationship of creator, creation, and ourselves. If that story were written today, the account would be framed probably in terms of current cosmology. But the truths it would communicate about those relationships would be the same. I'll talk about those truths in a little while. So in many ways, my whole time since leaving this Willamette Valley half a century ago has been spent trying to figure out how to connect those two influences. The experience of a loving God and the experience of the goodness, wildness, and beauty of the created world, which we can also describe as the biosphere, or the environment, or nature. In about my second year of graduate school, the medieval historian Lynn White gave an address to the American Academy of Science, which was later published as the influential essay, The Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. In it, White attempts to provide one answer to that question. What does Christianity have to do with the biosphere? And we were asked to frame our discussion tonight in terms of that hugely influential essay, which is over 50 years old, almost 50 years old now. How many have read that essay by Lynn White? Are you familiar with it? Not that familiar. It still shows up in anthologies everywhere. Evaluating his answer to that question, what does Christianity have to do with the environment, is one of our main tasks tonight. I've begun with a little autobiography because for none of us, whatever our religious or philosophical background, can this question of what White calls our ecological crisis be merely academic or theoretical. All three words in that phrase, his title, our ecological crisis, are important. Ecological, certainly. White wrote shortly before those first photos from space, which showed us a living blue and white Earth in stark contrast to the lifeless horizon of the moon. Today, hardly any thoughtful person is unaware that we live in an ecosphere, a planet of life, unique in the solar system, perhaps unique in the whole universe. And if the state of that living planet evoked from White the word crisis in 1967, that word, crisis, is much more appropriate today. Still, for us, the most important word in White's title, Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, is our. The environmental crisis is indeed our problem, and our conversation here tonight might be a failure if, in answering the main question, is Christianity harmful or beneficial to the environment? That's one of the forms of which I saw it advertised. We diverted attention from our own moral responsibility to deal with the crisis that White talked about in his famous essay. I suspect that Alan and I agree that the important thing tonight is not to win an argument, but to become clearer about how and why we should care for the earth. So let me move quickly to the heart of that thesis by Lynn White. His argument, it seems to me, has three parts. The first is that the state of the planet is bad, getting worse. I can only agree. As I said, the word crisis is much more appropriate now than when White wrote back in 1967. Back then, when the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was only about 320, not much above the 280 it has been through most of human history, he wrote prophetically that our present consumption of fossil fuels threatens to change the chemistry of the globe's atmosphere with consequences we are only beginning to guess, he said in 1967. Now that composition has increased in my lifetime from 320 parts per billion to 400. It's going up about 2 per year. And we no longer have to guess at the consequences. Among them are the accelerating acidification of the ocean, and one of the greatest periods of species extinction in the history of the planet. The second part of White's argument is that the rapidly deteriorating state of the biosphere is the direct result of a union of science and technology, which is a uniquely Western development. Here, too, I don't find much to disagree with in White's argument, but I do want to question some of the assumptions that lie behind those words, science and technology. The third part of his argument is the one that concerns us the most tonight, because it takes us into the really important topic of the evening, which is not really White's argument, but how and why we should act in this state of planetary crisis. And it really has a double point. The first is that Christianity is mainly responsible for this union of science and technology. The second is that because of the disastrous effects of that union of science and technology, Christianity, in his words, bears a huge burden of guilt for the current state of the planet. Now, White packs a lot into this final point, and I think that some of it's true, and some of it's partly true, and some of it's simply false. So let me unpack his argument a bit. The unequivocally true part of his argument is that science is, in part, a legacy of Christianity. I say in part because the history of science is very complicated indeed. And here White isn't a very good guide. He implies that modern science grew directly by a slow process of development from Greek sources. Now, Greek and later Islamic scientists were very good at mathematics. We are forever in their debt. But as you know, by the way, how many of you are in the sciences? Just out of curiosity, more than about half of you. As you know, especially, mathematics is only one part of science. The other part is observation, paying careful attention to a world which keeps surprising us. You don't even need a real objective world to do mathematics. It deals with an ideal world, and we can argue about that. We won't. So science had to free itself from the old Greek notion that the world was an imperfect copy of ideas which existed perfectly in some eternal realm, perhaps the mind of God. Before modern science could really begin, we had to learn to pay attention to the way the world was, not the way we thought it should be. This was made clear back in the 1930s in an important series of articles by the Oxford philosopher M.B. Foster, published in the British philosophical journal Mind. Their overall title was The Christian Doctrine of Creation and the Rise of Modern Science. His conclusion is important both for our understanding of White's argument and for the far greater purpose of understanding the springs of our own action towards the threatened biosphere. First, said Foster, the God that we meet in Hebrew and Christian scripture is not bound by rational necessity, but is free. He does what he wills to do. A more familiar description is that this is a God of love. The second part of Foster's argument is that the Christian view of creation is the result of this free character of God. Thus, creation, the universe, is contingent. That's a fancy word which means that it's not necessary or predictable. It's full of marvelous things, from galaxies to rainbirds to hummingbirds to human beings, and none of them have to be. It's a surprise. It's not necessary. And third, if creation is thus contingent, if you couldn't imagine it by sitting back and thinking about it, if it is surprising and unpredictable, the work of a free and loving creator, then the only way of knowing that created world is empirically. We can't sit back and think about it. We have to go out and look at it. Science, therefore, must be empirical, based on paying attention to things before it can be rational or mathematical. White largely, in his essay, misses this truth, that the essential roots of science are not only in the universe's law-like behavior, which can be described mathematically, it's also, crucially, in appreciation of the contingent nature of the universe, its ability to keep surprising us, its nature as a gift. And of course, a gift implies a giver. Since creation is, as White rightly recognizes, a kind of book written by the Creator, we should pay attention to it, not so it can tell us what we already know, but so it can open up to us the inexhaustible character of the Creator God. Creation is thus of value for itself, not for its human usefulness. To be sure, all creatures, plants and animals included, have to use their world in order to survive. We humans are no different. But White is quite wrong, it seems to me, in implying that those medieval Christians he wrote about were somehow unique in applying their technological ingenuity to their needs. Humans everywhere have always done that with whatever tools they had. The rest of the natural world has suffered because of it. On every continent, there's strong enough evidence that when human beings first showed up, the large, slow-moving sources of meat, from mammoths to moas, disappeared shortly afterwards. And for further example, the inhabitants of Mesopotamia and many parts of Asia managed to reduce their land to near desert through grazing, irrigation, solvenization, and overcropping. All this human damage was done way before Christian ideas of human dominion. So the problem is not with Christianity, it's with being human. The fact that science flourished first in Christian nations and thus became available to those people to increase their power over the earth is true, and it's regrettable. But the problem is not with science or with the Christian story itself. It's rather the result of Christians failing to live up to the truths of what they say they believe. So let me spend the rest of my time sketching for you what I think I've discovered in that half-century since I left that farm in the Willamette Valley about what the Christian story does imply about our relationship to the earth. For I do think it's a help and not a hindrance in our care of the earth. My purpose here is both to explain some foundational Christian ideas and answer what seems to me the most serious mistake in White's argument. Serious both because it's flatly wrong and because it's the one part of his important essay which is most widely remembered and accepted. White says, in summary of the biblical creation story, that, in his words, quoting White now, God planned all of this for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. And sometimes Christians and whole Christian cultures have acted that way, but it's breathtakingly wrong as a summary of the Christian story and biblical teaching. So let me briefly sketch what I think is a more accurate Christian view in terms of 6 propositions. First, the universe is best understood as creation by a personal being outside the universe. There really are only 2 options when you think about it. Either the universe is a purposeless accident, or it was created with a purpose that's consistent with personhood, consistent with the kind of discussions of morality that we're having here tonight. Second, creation is good. Not, as for example in much Eastern thought, a wheel of painful change in which our only hope is to escape from the physical. And it's good in and for itself, not just because it's useful to us. Since this idea directly contradicts White's widely believed claim that physical creation has no purpose save to serve man's purposes, it's his words, I need to dwell on that a bit. The clearest evidence for this, oddly enough, is that this is not all made for man, is hidden in the numerological symbolism of the Hebrew creation story. Hebrew culture gave an exalted place to the number 7. But Adam, the word means humanity, male and female, is made, as you recall, not on the 7th day, but on the 6th, along with the rest of the animals, to which, as the story implies, he's thus clearly related. The 7th day is reserved for the Sabbath, not for man. The Sabbath is a time of rest. The Hebrew word is shalom, a peace in which humans, animals, and the Creator rest in harmonious relationships. A third thesis: human beings are both creatures, like everyone else, animals, like everything else, and they have a special place in creation. They're both ordinary animals, part of the rest of the, like every other creature, share DNA with everything else, every other living thing, and they are special. Their commonality, their earthiness, is dramatically expressed in the Hebrew pun behind the word Adam. Adam, mankind, is made from Adamah, earth. It's like saying humans are made from humus. But our specialness is clear as well. These same creatures of dust are made, as the account goes, in the image of God. What that means and does not mean, I will discuss in a moment. They're given dominion over other creatures. And this is not said of anything else in creation. Now, this specialness of the human and the concept of dominion is widely understood as having given unlimited license for humans to use the earth for their purposes. This is a mistake. But we should not dismiss the idea of human specialness too quickly. This was brought home to me many years ago when I had the privilege of attending the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. It was convened, as you recall, to talk about the health of the planet and its 10 million species of living things. But except for a few stray birds and parasites, only human beings attended. It was the Earth Summit, but the whales didn't come, the trees didn't come. Only human beings came. It's as though we humans were and are the voice and consciousness of the earth. We do mess up the earth like no other creature. And modern science and technology vastly accelerates our ability to do that. We also seem to be the only creatures who know and care about this. And here, our science and technology is a great aid. But we are undeniably different. Fourth, the form that human dominion is to take over the earth is care. What dominion and rule might mean is spelled out in the second creation story, Genesis 2. Adam, in the biblical story, is placed in a garden, told to tend it. The Hebrew word is the same as the word for serve. And he is to keep it as well. The word is used later in the Bible in a famous blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Evidently, we are to keep creation as God keeps us. Fifth, the whole biblical story can be understood as a series of painful lessons about what it means to be in the image of God. It means not to lord it over each other or other creatures, but to love and care for them. The central example of this pattern of self-giving love for others is Jesus, the supreme example of the love which is the source and sustaining energy of the universe. Now, curiously, Lynn White knew this and said it clearly. At the end of his article, he points to St. Francis of Assisi, that remarkable medieval radical who did so much to help his age recover what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. He disdained wealth, cared for the poor, and was remarkably open to non-human creatures. He did this in imitation of the Creator God revealed in Jesus, who, and these are White's words, in the ultimate gesture of cosmic humility, assumed flesh, lay helpless in a manger, and hung dying on a scaffold. White calls Francis the greatest spiritual revolutionary in Western history. But, and here is White's greatest mistake, shared by many Christians today and throughout history, he fails to recognize that the pattern of service, humility, and self-giving, which Francis represents, is not, as he implies, an aberration, a heresy. It is the basic attitude of self-giving which lies at the very heart of the gift of creation. And it is seen most clearly in Jesus, and is thus at the heart of genuine Christianity. It's certainly an attitude which the world needs today. And White recognizes this when he proposes in the concluding sentence of his essay that St. Francis be viewed as the patron saint of ecologists. White doesn't mention that it was this very attitude of humility and openness to the natural world that nourished the early movement of empirical science, but that's another much longer story. My sixth and final point, and I beg your indulgence to give me this final point, even though I'm being shown a sign that says your time is up. But I don't want to just a couple minutes. You aren't going to do anything terrible. My sixth and final point is a direct answer to that question which frames this conversation. Is Christianity harmful or beneficial to the environment? Obviously, the answer is yes. You're supposed to laugh. It's both. It's harmful or beneficial? Well, yes. Christians and Christian communities have, like pretty much all humans, have done great harm, far beyond our simple need to live. The more our science and technology improves, the more harm we are capable of doing. The right name for that harm is sin. The right response is repentance. I recently heard of a Christian thinker, interestingly, in terms of White's argument, he was a Franciscan, who has called for the regular practice of eco-penance, repentance for sins against the gift of the ecosphere. But we humans are also capable of being beneficial to the earth. The word actually means blessing. It has the same Latin root as benediction. How can humans be a blessing to the earth? The basic human response to the mysterious gift of the created world, what we are rather lamely calling the environment, is wonder, awe, and thankfulness. Out of this basic response flow three activities which are unique to human beings. One is worship, our expression of thanks for the gift of being. Another is art, our response to the gift of creation with our own creativity. The third is science, our ability to know. Unfortunately, the delight of that knowledge is all too easily subverted by our technology into mere efficient consumption. But that science, which has deep roots in Christianity, can also be a blessing. I have a friend in the environmental studies program at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. His name is Eric Higgs. His work centers on the concept of restorative ecology. How can we humans begin to set right the damage we've done? When I told him I was going to Oregon State University, he asked me to greet a friend of his, Alan Thompson, a philosopher who was doing important work in applying the idea of virtues to the changing planetary situation. It seems to me that that very concept of restorative ecology takes us to the threshold of theology. Restorative is a word that means something very close to salvation. Likewise, the work which Alan has done on what virtues are needed for the time ahead takes us to the threshold of asking these big theological questions. When a Christian prays the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, they are, it seems to me, praying for the restoration of God's shalom, that harmony between creator, creation, and creation's most problematic inhabitants, human beings. I'd like to respectfully conclude by suggesting that that work on restorative ecology and on virtues which underlie it can perhaps best be understood from within the framework provided by the Christian story. That we are given the immense privilege of being part of the Creator's healing work, and thus beneficial, a benefit, a blessing for creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson. I'd like to have a quick reminder on the audience. Make sure your cell phones are on silent, please, out of respect for the rest of the audience and also speakers as well. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Alan Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a professor of philosophy here at OSU. Before teaching at Oregon State, Dr. Thompson was on faculty at Clemson University in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. Here at OSU, he teaches courses in ethics, environmental ethics, and classical moral theories. His research interests include environmental philosophy, social and political philosophy, and practical reason. Dr. Thompson's publications include Ethical Adaptation to Climate Change, a book published by MIT Press, and Natural Goodness and Abandoning the Economy of Value, a journal article published in Ethics, Place, and Environment. Dr. Thompson has also taken part in NPR's Philosophy Talk, wherein he gave a talk on the moral cost of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Alan Thompson.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming this evening. I need a moment, and I've learned that it's quite a different program than you're accustomed to. We have to screen and just go on. It goes off and on a little irregularly. I noticed that in Lauren's presentation. It's just a kind of inconsistent connection. People talk through this. I do want to, like Lauren did, give my thanks to the Socratic Club generally, particularly Gary Ferguson, my colleague, and Peter Kilgore, the president, also Matt Rubin for first inviting me here this evening, and Lauren Wilkinson, also my interlocutor, and for the nice things he's just said about my work in connection with the next topic. Let's see if I can get this going. It's all working the folder. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. All right. First, I want to say something about the thesis as advertised on this talk just very quickly. Is Christianity? I think it's the placement. Maybe that's better. I just think it's not a good connection between the English. I'm sorry about this.
Well,
I think maybe, let me hold it like this. I think it's something about the antenna being tucked away. Yeah, I'm feeling a little more confident. I think it's okay. Okay. But I want to say just a little something about this framing, and I sure would be a brazen man to come before you and say, indeed, taking the composition, my thesis is Christianity is harmful to the environment. And that is not my thesis this evening, just so you know. I prefer a different framing, as is in some of the advertisements. Is Christianity helpful or a hindrance to sound environmental stewardship? Can it be positively contributory, or is it some sort of drag, slowing down the work that we all know that we need to do, and largely we're all on board here? My position will be largely a non-committal on this. It could be either. It's not really contrary or contributory to the problem. It's not uniquely helpful or problematic of all sorts of ideological worldviews or world religious views. I endorse instead a practical pluralism. And this is the view that any reasonable scheme or metaphysical framework that promotes protective environmental legislation should be welcomed. So whatever our metaphysical outlook is or our religious orientation, as long as we have convergence on some of the same policy goals, which many of us do, independent of our ideological backing, we should have a big tent and be welcome. Welcome. For us to talk a little bit about the Lynn White thesis. The question put to me was, what is the Lynn White thesis, and does it support the claim that Christianity is antithetical to sustainable environmental stewardship? So really the most influential formation on contemporary environmental ethics of the Lynn White thesis, in my reconstruction, is the following sort of argument. Anthropocentrism is the ideological driver of the environmental crisis. I'll define it in a moment, but anthropocentrism is fundamentally the idea that it's only human beings who have an intrinsic moral value. And this is then the words of Lynn White that Lauren was emphasizing, that the rest of creation, the rest of the non-human world, has a mere instrumental value to be put to our ends. That's the view of anthropocentrism. The diagnosis is that anthropocentrism is the kind of ideological framework that's the driver of the environmental crisis. Christianity, then, as a major ideological worldview, is the most anthropocentric of all world religions. This would lead us to the conclusion, then, that Christianity is the ideological driver of the environmental crisis, bearing the tremendous guilt, as Lauren also interpreted the argument. This is the definition of anthropocentrism. Only human beings have intrinsic moral value. It's also a bit of interpreting the world through our human value lens or scheme, or seeing the world. How could we do otherwise? It turns out that anthropocentrism, for a lot of reasons I can't go into here, is really not the best diagnosis of the ideological root of our environmental crisis. It's an ambiguous sort of term. It means a good deal of different things. There's an ontological thesis about not putting man in the center of the universe, which was put out by Copernicus and Galileo and these sorts of views. And then there's an ethical thesis, but it involves a good number of problems. Really, there are better terms in our philosophical lexicon. Speciesism is the first. And speciesism is the discrimination on the basis of species when species is not the morally relevant criteria. Often we treat non-human animals, despite the pain and suffering that we know this brings them, in a way as though that pain and suffering did not count whatsoever, or is radically discounted from the pain that we humans undergo under similar circumstances. And it's not obvious how this could be morally justified. Also, a certain kind of human chauvinism is a bit more precise in the diagnosis of the additives that stand behind our treatment of the non-human world. This is discrimination against non-humans on grounds which are not rationally justified. Speciesism is always wrong, and human chauvinism is a bit more problematic. It's kind of resetting the goalposts all the time to keep all in all human beings the most important. And this is a kind of morally problematic position. So for reasons I really can't go into here, my claim is that parts of anthropocentrism are in fact unavoidable. And like our thinking through our value scheme and framework, if we try to strip ourselves entirely of values that are unintelligible to humans, we can't do anything. The ethics must speak to us, and our values are clearly human values. And also, some of it may in fact be ethically desirable, which are not entirely parts I'm going to. But this brings us to a kind of conclusion concerning the Lynn White thesis. If anthropocentrism is widely a misunderstood problem, as I indicated that I believe it is, then it simply will not matter that Christianity is the most anthropocentric of religions. That can be true still. I don't have to engage with that thesis. Right? If it is, and indeed Lynn White is correct about that, that it holds the rest of the world as merely instrumental, and this underwrites our dominating attitudes towards it and our misuse of it, it simply isn't a problem. Anthropocentrism isn't the underlying problem of the environmental crisis. And Christianity then is sort of off the hook, as it were, even if it is the most anthropocentric field. I'd like to revisit Lynn White's thesis, though, put in other terms. The roots of our ecological crisis lie in our Judeo-Christian idea that humanity is to dominate in the sense of control and subdue nature. God, this thing things going on here. So what does environmental stewardship mean? I'm going to switch gears a little bit and come back around to this question of the reading of Lynn White's thesis about domination over nature. Stewardship itself as a term could be misleading. A steward is someone who is tasked with managing another's property. It's a person whose responsibility it is to take care of something. Now, I don't want to beg the question about ownership. Right? That is necessarily.
Just step back.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah. I don't want to beg the questions of ownership, that the world of creation belongs to God in some sense, and we always, as a steward, has to take care of the bags of someone getting on a ship, something like this, right? I'd like to focus a little bit more on the notion of moral responsibility, that a steward is the responsible party for something or another. So, as Lauren indicated, there are at least two readings of Genesis, dominion sort of interpretations. And the first is this sort of license to conquer from Genesis 1, lines 26 through 29. God said, "Let us make man in our own image," some paraphrasing, "and let them be masters of the fish and sea," and so on. God blessed them, saying to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and conquer it. Be masters of all the fish in the sea," in this sort of language. This obviously more strongly supports the charge to dominate nature, that man has a license to dominate, control, and subdue nature, and this is a command coming, an imperative coming from God. Although in the second Genesis, line 15 in particular, as we cited already, we get a different grounds for an interpretation that's more in line with care and cultivation. Yahweh God, quote, took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and take care of it. This supports a more responsive and responsible type of oversight. So do we have a moral responsibility to be good stewards of the earth? And if so, what's the reason that we bear this responsibility? Do we have a moral responsibility? Well, divine appointment is one way to answer yes. And it's one way to interpret a good kind of stewardship, leaning on this interpretation from Genesis 2 of care of creation, rather than a despotic position. But certainly, an owner or a kind of command from a supernatural being that we care for this thing in a particular kind of way are reasonable grounds to understand that we thereby have a responsibility to do this. That's what we're trying to unpack. Right? My position is really, in the end, not all that different from Lawrence, I think, regarding the substantive stance we want to take. It's really just whether God plays an essential or ineliminable role in this. I want to explore a little how a secular perspective could justify the claim that human beings have a moral responsibility to be good stewards. So yes, I claim we do have an obligation for responsible stewardship, but why? One kind of answer is that our obligation may be based on the moral status, that is the intrinsic value of features of the non-human world in other individual organisms, species of organisms, or ecosystems or particular places, parts of the non-human world, as is explained here. This is to take the sort of traditional environmental ethics approach of a non-anthropocentric, attributing intrinsic value to the natural world. It's because it has a moral standing in some sense that we have obligations to it for care and responsible oversight. I'd Another kind of avenue a secular humanist could take is to say that the obligation is the moral status of future generations, human beings. This does not require a problematic attribution of an intrinsic value to parts of the non-human world to allow us to remain believing that human beings are the only bearers of a kind of moral intrinsic value. But it turns out there are some well-known philosophical problems understanding how it could be that we could even possibly harm future human beings. And I don't want to go too far astray in this quickly, otherwise it's known as Derek Parfit's non-identity problem. It's a bit of a technical philosophy. And it turns out that the idea is the policies that we set today, slowly as they unfold, change the human beings who come into existence as society rearranges itself around these policies. And if you give this long enough time, a different group of human beings will come into existence than would have been brought into existence had we chosen some other policy today, a couple hundred years out. And on the presumption that it's better to exist than not to exist, the people who come into existence because of our poor environmental policy choices really don't have any claims against us that we've harmed them, because it's better to come into existence than not. And if we had chosen the more environmentally protective policies, they wouldn't have come into existence at all. So philosophers love a little problem like this, a little logical sort of just understanding how we could harm future generations. I want to set up a kind of problem for basing our obligations to be good stewards on the planetary biosphere, as I tend to be on future generations. I want to introduce now a third approach, which is really the one that I favor. I want to start with the quote by the great American poet Stan Lee, creator of Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And we have great power, it turns out, over the rest of life. Because human beings are causally responsible for affecting the basic conditions of the biosphere, we are the ones collectively to be praised or blamed. There's a moral perspective or an attitude that can be taken towards those who have the power to make things come out one way or another. And it turns out that collectively, we are they. We have the capacity to affect conditions of the biosphere, thus we are morally responsible. We're distinguishing two different senses of moral responsibility. In this backward-looking liability sense, we are the ones on the hook who are rightly held accountable for what we have done in terms of breaking it or keeping it in good shape. That's just the sort of notion of backwards liability, notion of responsibility. We're accustomed to these things in legal thinking. However, our obligation, and I put this in quotes now, to be good stewards does not rest, in my view, on duties that are owed to any other beings with moral standing. Be they, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, be they God, future generations, other animals, species, ecosystems, or even other extraterrestrials, if there are any. It's not some other beings that we owe the obligation to based on their moral status. I want to claim in the relevant sense that we owe being good stewards to ourselves. I'm going to show my age up here a little bit now because really the way I'd like you to think about this is that old US Army slogan. When I was a kid, they were trying to recruit, be all you can be. Be all you can be. Be the best you that you can be. Exemplify what it is to be a human being. And the human beings on my position are the ones who are in fact responsible for the conditions on the planet. Since we are the responsible parties, we belong to the species that is of the kind that is responsible, to be a good human being or a good human being will exhibit the virtue of environmental responsibility. Now, this is a different notion of responsibility. In this sense, it's a forward-looking conception of role responsibility. It's a virtue notion. It's a character trait of managing well the plurality of normative demands put upon us in virtue of the role we occupy. So there are good babysitters, in this sense, responsible babysitters, and there are irresponsible babysitters, even if the irresponsible ones meet all of the obligations to the parents connected with the role of being a babysitter. Even if they put the kids to, they give them the food, put them to bed, all these sorts of things on that, right? We still know the difference between a responsible one. There's responsible police officer, there's responsible teacher. So I'm trying to get you to think about a character trait the good-making character trait of human being, that is, the character trait of being a responsible agent to the plurality of normative demands upon us. And our role, I'm claiming now, hasn't always been this way, but now is to be stewards of the planet, managers of the conditions under which all life exists, the one blue dot where we know life does exist. The final question I want to address is what good stewardship might look like. I claim that human beings ought to conceive of themselves as planetary managers, with the aim of bringing back the flourishing of a diversity of life. But how ought we undertake this role of being managers of the planet? We've heard at least two different possibilities, the largest framework for thinking about this. The first is a kind of aggressive, controlling, or dominating interventions in what's going on in life, that we know better and we can fix it and make it the way it ought to be to serve human ends, something like this. We read this in the license to sort of dominate reading in Genesis. The second is a cultivating, caring, or husbandry or gardening sort of metaphor. Right? To take care of it, to intervene, but make it the way that it could be in a more subtle and less dominating sort of aspect. And the third, we often hear from conservationists, contemporary conservationists, preservationists, is to just back off entirely. Right? Non-intervention, let it go wild, stay out, get the humans out of there, nature knows best, and let it run in its own way. It is hubristic for us to intervene or interfere in any sort of way, whether it's just by the rather mundane modes of gardening, thank you, or it's the more dominating sort of forms of intervention. I think the real answer between these three is more difficult than these three options would allow. I'm going to try to outline a view just in closing between the second and the third, oddly sort of incorporating both. First, I want to point out that we are responsible as responsible agents, both for those things that we do, proactively undertake, and the things that we allow. The things that we allow to happen and unfold, where we could otherwise have intervened. So where we could intervene and change the course of things, but we don't, we are responsible for that. Right? We have the power both to do and to allow. So we're responsible also for the unfolding of things that we don't intervene with and bring about by our own positive agency. Now, not all management needs to be an active, hands-on kind of engagement. We have a proclivity as doers, makers, and shakers, as managers, to get our hands in there and try to do it and fix it. Right? We've got to be a little wary, I think, of the psychological tendency in human beings themselves. When we give ourselves license or recognize that we're in a position, we can't really refuse to make decisions over the outcome of the conditions of the planet, to tinker. And so a lot of my friends in the environmental field, environmental ethics, say, oh, management, we cannot talk about management because we'll just go in and screw everything up. You know how humans are. I said, well, that's all right, but I want everyone to remember that one kind of management decision, it's a decision of management strategy, is to not intervene in selective places and times, to let nature, whatever forces are in play, run its own course. And we decide where and when that happens, and that's a management decision. I'd like to say, in the most general way, right, sort of contrary to this notion of management, that we ought generally let nature run wild as much as possible. Given the conditions today, we ought to allow for spaces to remain undeveloped by human activity and is influenced as little as possible. This is a traditional kind of non-intervention stance, but I want to say this is a management decision. We'll let it run as wild as possible in the broadest of terms. But at the same time, because of pervasive and background human influence on the basic conditions of the biosphere, and here I'm thinking about global climate change for one, but other things like radical nitrogen deposition that's going on, massive species extinctions due to anthropogenic drivers, and also invasive species, non-native species, or non-endemic species traveling all around the world, mixing up. Right? Ecosystems are taking on new shapes, new assemblages, and new functional characterizations because of human influence. And we need a bit more of a science of what happens when humans affect and intervene, influence natural ecosystems in a way rather than just describing the ecosystems that are historically received by us in the position. So I'm advocating for a kind of development of an intervention ecology is a kind of science of human intervention in a lot of things, but also letting things go as wild as possible and non-interventions as possible. So here, I want to draw some conclusions, and I'll probably be, in closing, a little more polemic than Lauren was so kind to cite my work, although it's strategic. And explain all my views are really best understood, underwritten by a theistic worldview. So, is Christianity a help or a hindrance to sound environmental stewardship? At worst, I want to say it's unnecessary. In fact, I want to take a bit of a stronger position on that. I think it's unnecessary in all cases. I think that there's compelling and intelligible stories for why we ought to be stewards and what sort of shape that stewardship ought to take that are completely based in a secular worldview and are humanistic and just depend on powers of reason. We can convince ourselves that this is what we ought to do with good grounds for following the light of our own powers of reason. At worst, though, it could be detrimental, given this sort of domineering interpretation, the license to conquer reading in Genesis, which Warren did indeed, to his credit, say is a mistaken interpretation. But it's out there, and people read the Bible in a variety of ways, as everybody knows. In fact, if creation care is based on the preservation of nature in its historic conditions, those sort of conditions that have characterized the planetary, the collection of planetary ecosystems that we call the biosphere through the Holocene, the last 12,000 years, then creation care will be ineffective in the face of a radically changing world ecology. The future ecological state of the planet is not going to be like the one that any of us know, that our parents knew, that our grandparents knew, or that any human beings have known through the course of human civilization. We're looking at predictions for global climate change alone, well exceeding, in all likelihood, 2 degrees Celsius rise, more likely approaching 4 degrees Celsius rise. And the last ice age was about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius cooler than the pre-industrial norm. The average surface temperature of the globe was about 15 degrees Celsius all the way through the Holocene. We're looking at a world that is that much different. And species and ecosystems won't move whole hog north towards the poles up into Canada. They'll go one at a time in a kind of Glisonian fashion. The ecosystems will come apart and will reassemble into novel ecosystems. The idea today is that Earl Ellis says that today 28 to 32% of the globe is already covered, the terrestrial non-frozen globe, is covered with these novel ecosystems that are assemblages of biotic and abiotic properties that have no analog in the historic record. So that if creation care is to take care to preserve and conserve the natural world as we know it built, and as we have received it, it will be ineffective. Because within the next 100 or 200 years, it's all going to radically change. Even I think the most optimistic outcomes of how quickly we dial down greenhouse gas emissions. At best, Christianity can contribute something. It can provide a kind of motivation and a particular kind of orientation for enlightened and progressive planetary management. It's one possible charge to understand yourself as under an imperative from your creator, a supernatural being, to take care and manage the planet. But that's not the only way to understand this charge at all. And so I think it's a big tent. Whatever motivates you to get you to do this sort of work and to take on this sort of attitude or adopt this philosophy, which I believe is the most reasonable, that's good, and I'm glad to have you on board, as it were, right? Policy convergence on those sort of things and these sorts of attitudes. Although, as I said below, I don't think it's necessary. Thank you for your attention. I think it's still okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. We will now move to the discussion section of tonight's debate, for which we have 20 minutes. The speakers will alternate asking questions of one another, and I will allow for free-form discussion in general. Speakers, please limit your answers to about 1 to 2 minutes, as our time is quite limited tonight. Also, I would like to remind the audience to remain respectful of our speakers by not applauding until the end of the discussion section. Give us a minute while we set up, and Dr. Wilkins, you will have the first question for Dr. Thompson.
Excellent, we're going up there.
Yeah, we're going.
Well, you were talking.
As I don't like these things. Stuff in my hand. As I thought would be the case, we don't really disagree very much on most things, but we do have obviously one fundamental disagreement, and so I guess I could, yeah, I agree with your analysis, what you say about novel ecosystems. Your second point there in the screen at the first end did seem a bit beside the point in the sense that you said if creation care is based upon, you seem to assume creation care was based on restoring things to the way they should be, or keeping, and it's obviously not going to be possible. But there's nothing in a Christian view that says we can't and shouldn't be sensitive to the very kinds of changes that you're talking about. Creation care, in my view, doesn't mean kind of restoring to some Edenic state. We have to deal with a damaged and changing world. I want to ask a more substantial question in a minute, but how would you respond to that? It seems to me that there's nothing in the Christian view I outlined that would keep creation care understood as a
yeah. So it's stated as a hypothetical proposition. If this is the case for creation care, if it's wedded to a kind of preservation of the historic shape of the received ecosystems, then it will be ineffective because change is coming. So it seems to me you're just quite logically denying that that's what creation care is, and that.
Right. And I don't know of anyone who would take that position. So well,
yeah,
we'll
okay.
keep that behind us.
I guess so. You're an expert on the view, and I don't know much about it, but I think it's not just a Christian perspective than characteristic of creation care, but really more characteristic of our broader culture to want to think that what environmentalism really means is holding on to nature as we have received it. And if we can't protect and keep nature the way it is today, we will have failed. Right? And there is a certain kind of failure there. So insofar as we live in a broadly Christian society where the Christian values or Christian framework is pervasive or underwriting Western civilization, anything like that, and that is a characteristic sort of environmentalist view of the Western world that most people sort of unthinkingly, I mean, this is how most of us as environmentalists were raised. Save and protect it, so it will always be that way. And we hear the kind of language, of course, the mistakes that the Western Europeans made coming over to the North American continent, believing this is the land just as God has made it. And God just as God has left it, we need to set it aside and protect it. Once they started setting up the national parks. It was heavily managed, of course, as we know now, by work of good environmental historians, by Native Americans. It wasn't a received wilderness.
Sure. Again, I think I really disagree with you there, except again, I don't think that none of the responsible creation caregivers I know of would take that fairly simplistically.
I'm sure that's right.
But I guess the more fundamental question, and the one point of disagreement, would go back to your initial point that, in a sense, whether Christianity is a help or a hindrance doesn't really matter, because in the long run, we have this enormous problem to face, and if Christianity helps, good, we can use all the allies we can get in this struggle. That, in a way, sidesteps to what to me is a hugely important question. I guess it's the question of what story you would inhabit, and on what basis do we talk at all about things like moral responsibility. And I guess let me ask this question in terms of give me a little background. I belong, as does your colleague, our mutual friend Eric Higgs, to an organization called the Galliano Conservancy. We do a lot of work in restoring and educating our little environment of Valley Island.
Mhm.
And I'm on the board of that group, and we had a retreat at our house on Long. And we spent almost all of our time talking about what to do and how to do it. But what we hardly ever talk about why. And I'm a little frustrated about this, so I'm leading this retreat, so I asked people to answer this question. What story, what larger story do you see your work in the Valley Island Conservancy a part of? And most people sidestep the question. But one person answered, and I think expressed the thought of many, myself and a Jewish woman, first of all, was on the board, pretty much said what I said here, that we're working in creation, which is a gift, and we have a kind of responsibility to care for that gift, that the earth is creation. The other answer was, that story is that we are fundamentally a part of nature. We need to get back to nature. We need to be a part of nature. If we recognize our big problem has been thinking of is the anthropocentric problem. We are different from nature. And that's a mistake. We need to recognize that we're part of nature. And that is, it seems to me, the only other story there is. And I said that towards the beginning. It seems to me there are really only two options. One is...
Could you just make sure you keep your mic up?
Yeah.
There.
One is the universe is a creation. The other is it's an accident. If it's an accident, then it's an accident which has produced us and our pretensions to moral decision making. But there's no basis for it, is there? I guess what I want to, the question I ask you is, what larger story are you a part of, as you call passionately and correctly, I feel, for moral responsibility in our relationship to the earth? Where does that passion come from? What is the basis of where do virtues come from? What are virtues based in? If in fact we are simply a result of a random cosmic accident.
Yeah, it's a good question, Lauren. There's a couple in there. I want to say first that my passion comes from my heart, right? Just like yours. The heart that I have, however I got that, and of course that's a metaphorical sort of notion. I'm the kind of creature that I am, whatever the origin of my being is. I'm composed at this moment to be this sort of emotional creature, driven and intelligent in the way that I am. It's not obvious to me in virtues. What underlies the virtues? Well, of course, you know that it was Aristotle, who was really the great-grandfather of the virtue theoretic tradition. All of the Greeks were virtue theorists, and supposedly took ethics. And while they had a pantheon of deities, they were not monotheistic and did not tell the same story of a personal God, a creator God, in the way that the Judeo-Christians do. So that story alone, that account alone that it could come from virtues, doesn't require the story of a personal God in this sort of relation, that narrative, although that narrative can provide a background of meaning. It seems to me, I guess to sort of flip the question on its head, why would we suppose that's the only possible kind of narrative that could give life meaning or motivate our wanting to be stewards of the world in which we find ourselves, because we are effective in changing it in one way or another? And we can imagine a moral perspective in which we can assess these things, because these are among the skills and powers that we have. And however it came to be that we have them, the fact that we have them, I think, sort of self-insulates the story, right? They are significant because that is the manifest power of the story, that we can take this perspective and see that. And so whether there's a divine watchmaker, or the story of a mere accident, or just the motion of matter through the universe, tremendous mystery that we don't understand, yields us, we're still in the same position. can still have the same set of powers and can be as motivated from the heart to engage in the work that we judge to be right. And of course, there are many, 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 many people out there who do not have a Judeo-Christian monotheistic worldview, yet they're perfectly legitimate and well-intended and live meaningful lives as environmentalists. So I guess I'd flip the question and say, why should we think that the story of the Judeo-Christian God is a necessary component to take this appropriate attitude towards the environment that we both agree on?
Yeah, and at that point, again, I can't prove an answer to that. I can speak from my heart and say that this story makes the most sense to me for all kinds of reasons. For one thing, because the alternative does seem to me to be the assumption of a mysterious but still random and purposeless origin to ourselves.
Dr. Wilson, please make sure like this.
And it seems, I guess we can't, we're not going to get too much further on this kind of argument, except it seems to me that really what is at issue here is the question of which story of the universe and our presence as conscious, thinking beings within it is most likely to be true. The idea that we are ourselves creatures of a conscious and moral being, or that we are just a random action. Which of those is most persuasive? We have to each decide.
Yeah, my view is personally that there's a kind of false dichotomy when you propose these only two options, and only one of them is more likely to be true. There's many different ways we can cut the kinds of possibilities that are in the account for bringing us here. And I'm perfectly sympathetic with the idea that this is the story, a story of a Judeo-personal God creator is the intelligible one you think is most likely to be true. I actually think, given the kind of ecological crisis that we face, that the veracity of the story is not the important part here. Right? I thought you were actually going to say which story is the most effective in getting people to act in the ways that we can all largely agree on what ought to be done. And which sort of story is in fact the most effective in getting people to do where we have agreement on the kind of activities that should be undertaken. And this isn't a question of truth. I mean, I'm a philosopher really interested in the truth, but then there's also there's a pragmatic philosophy, right? There's a whole theory of the truth about what works and what gets done. And while Rome is burning, we might be quite interested in saying that's great if it motivates you, and others have a different story that makes sense to them, and most importantly motivates them to say, that's fine, good story, find your people, tell yourself that story, get busy, build some community capacity, right? Build resilience for the changes that are coming, lower your consumption, work together to support one another, these sorts of things. I'm puzzled by the notion that truth is the appropriate criterion here, and that no other story stands to be as likely to satisfy the criterion of truth.
And again, I don't think we can reach agreement on that. It does seem to me the truth question is fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, if you put the pragmatic what works question first, you're opening the door to huge problems. What works is in the long run not going to lead to human or natural flourishing if it doesn't match the way the world is. But the way human beings are.
But if it works, if the criterion of success is flourishing of life, diversity of life, as Mike says, and it works, then it will work. Right? I mean, that's just the definition. If in fact it works, it will accomplish that because that's the goal, and that's just the criterion of success for counting this work. But I understand the worries about pragmatism that you're articulating, and I don't mean to say I'm an American pragmatist, or that I'm only interested in pragmatism here. I think given this environmental crisis, pragmatism might be given some priority over kind of metaphysical. Sorry. it's known that there's a wide variety timeless disagreements about the metaphysical truth around the world. And different cultures and different groups have had widely divergent views, and nobody ever settles on what is the truth here. And I don't think that settling on the truth of some metaphysical scheme is going to get done in time to start acting in the ways. And I think we've got to focus the notion of truth on what it is we ought to be doing. There are going to be true statements about what we ought to be doing. There are going to be statements about what we ought to be doing that are true, and there are going to be statements about what we ought to be doing that are false. And these are not statements, these are normative action guiding value statements, not statements about the way the world is on some metaphysical framework or not, or my relation to a creator or anything like that. That's the kind of truth that I'm interested in.
But the truth or falsity of those statements, what is that? That's based simply on whether or not they work.
No, whether they work or not, in my view, would be measured against whether you have, in other words, what is flourishing? Flourishing of human life and a diversity of life on the planet, a healthy planet, however we cash that out. Working is whatever gets us there. Right? And my claim is many things could work. This is a kind of psychological question about what motivates people to undertake those actions. Now, there are going to be claims about what we ought to do to bring that back. Which sort of policies we ought to follow, what sort of value scheme is generally the most conducive to this. There will be statements there that can be true or false. And so it's not the criterion of working that makes them true or false. I suppose that it is. It's, you're right. It's a kind of instrumentalist claim whether indeed these policies or these values will bring about the ends that we believe they will bring about. And that would be the notion of being true as a means to the end that we all agree upon for some sort of healthy, sustainable life.
Dr. So do you have a question for Dr. Wilkinson?
Well, I've been trying to throw some in. He had good questions for me, and my move a couple times was to try to respond and flip it over and ask him questions. I'm not sure that I have independent questions. It's really just this one we've been working over, and that we have good reasons to believe we won't be able to resolve tonight, right? About the requirement of a personal God creator to underwrite the sort of oomph or the normative oomph, the feeling that this is what we ought to do, or the kind of what our responsibilities are to do. There are many ways to understand what will get us to do that. I guess the question would be, why is God necessary? Why is a God necessary to do this? If it's possible to do it without a God, then why is God necessary?
I guess what comes through when you restate it that way, I'm very uncomfortable with. I'm not, that's certainly not the language I use, that I require a personal God to underwrite our ethics. It's rather that this is the only thing in my understanding that explains the whole range of human responses. I talked about our ability to know, our ability to do art, our need for worship, the universal feeling, regardless of what the religious framework is, to be thankful. That some conception that this universe is meaningful, what we both feel from our heart, what I tried to describe in terms of the way in which the virgin forest along the Santiago River shaped in me, which in many ways was pre-Christian or a-Christian. It's just a response to this mystery that this glorious, wild, beautiful mystery that we find ourselves in, and our response to it. It's difficult for me to understand how that can be no more significant than just a random movement of atoms. It occurs to me, I know we've had atheist on atheist debates here before, but One of the more interesting things that's happened in the last few years is the kind of flagship atheist Anthony Flew decided late in life. Some people say he was probably senile when he did it, and he just couldn't be an atheist anymore. He wasn't a Christian, but he said there's just too much sense that there's something big going on here that can't be explained by sheer chance. And I guess at the very minimum, I want to. I had the privilege of talking once with E.O. Wilson on this subject. And, Wilson said, they call me an atheist. I'm not an atheist. I can't be an atheist. And he's comfortable using the word creation, as is the climate scientist James Hansen. All of them feel that in some sense the concept of creation, that this is that we live in a gift, not an accident, is a richer framework for environmental action, because it's more true. Not really because it's more practical.
I'm sorry, Jim. This is all the time we have for this kind of section. Sorry, but we're now going to move to the question.
Let me make a response.
We'll have a minute. Is that?
Well, I was just going to get all nitpicky again, because you say you didn't say that it was necessary, that God was necessary, but then the language you switched to was that the only thing that explains all of this deep, meaningful human phenomena that we know is real is God. Well, wait, if that's the only thing that explains it, then that's a necessary condition for it. And that's the only sense in which I was using necessary. Then you back off a little bit sometimes and say, well, it's the only thing that I can understand that makes sense to it. You say, well, that's fine. That doesn't mean necessary. That means it's necessary for your understanding. But you well acknowledge that there's plenty of people who have all of the deep, rich human experiences that understand it under some other framework. So it's not necessary for them. It doesn't seem to be a necessary condition. It's not the only thing that can possibly explain it. And then finally, just to respond to the appeals to authority, named figures in the field, Anthony Flew, James Hansen, using creation language. Let's start with Anthony Flew. Many people, when they come to the end of their lives, make a change of heart. That doesn't mean it's any truer how they switch their opinions, right? That doesn't, just because he's a philosopher changes his heart. Right? There's also plenty of philosophers who go to their deathbed without any change in their atheistic position whatsoever. Just like that doesn't establish it. I can't see these are just appeals to circumstances. What's that called? It's just one case. I mean, it's a sample of one. An appeal to the climate scientists using the language of creation. Lord only knows under what context they're accepting this sort of language, and to interpret it by saying that they think this is the only possible explanation to capture the sort of meaning is just a kind of license of interpretation. So I'm not sure those are entirely straightforward arguments.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now is the question and answer time. If you have a question, you can come to either line. Please refrain from saying any statements of personal opinion or argue with either of the debaters. And after you answer your question, please return to your seat. Question takers, the debaters here, would you please make sure you limit your answers to about 1 to 2 minutes. When question askers, when you come to the mic, please designate first and foremost who your question is for, and I will let the person who the question is designated for answer first, and then the other person can have a minute or another comment or a response to that as well. If you have any questions, now is the time. We will have 45 minutes for question and answer section. So now is the time.
Hello. My question is for Dr. Wilkinson. As I've been listening to your responses, I keep hearing you use the word true or truth, and I was wondering if you could just maybe elaborate that or provide us with a definition of how you define truth. I'm a little unclear how you've been using that in context.
This is a Socratic club after all. I suppose I have to be able to define truth in 1 minute. Truth is Truth is the way things are. And I guess that would be distinguished from an understanding of truth that says it's the way I want them to be, or the way that things work. And I know we're at a moment in cultural philosophical history that's been very critical of the idea of truth, because truth has been used aggressively and in dangerous ways. The idea of truth, as Michael Foucault said, truth is a kind of totalitarianism, like a kind of. But I guess I believe that the universe is real. That I'm not just trapped inside my own head. That there's a real world out there, and that we can say things that are more true about it and things that are less true about it. And so I guess I've used my minute. The truth is about the way the world is, the way the world works. Science is an attempt to uncover that truth. There's not a radical difference between religious truth and scientific truth. We're both exploring what's real. And if we can't come to some commonly agreed on, we have to hold our views humbly and personally and passionately, but there's still a world out there to be explored. So when I speak about the truth of a creational understanding, I'm talking about the reality of God. That there is a God, and that the universe is the result of the action of God. And I'm also talking about the reality of the life and events around Jesus Christ. But this is something that is commonly accessible. It's not just an idea making. So,
Dr. Thompson?
I just might try to add a couple things. Typically, in philosophy classes, I talk about truth being a property of sentences. Sentences, many declarative sentences can either be true or false. Questions and commands, these sorts of sentences cannot be true or false, but declarative sentences, stating the way the world is, making some description of the world or prescription, can be true or false. It turns out, though, that they need to be sentences always true in virtue of the way the world is. So there either is or there isn't a God isn't necessarily true sentence. It's a tautology. It's true in virtue of its form. There either is a God or there isn't a God. That's true. It doesn't really matter which way the world is. It's just the form of the sentence. Now, the claim there is a God could be either true or false. I don't know that it's true. I'm not sure that it's false. And I'd sit somewhat skeptical about that. Stepping back then from sentences, we might think about what, the relation of the mind and the world, intentions and sort of reality. And what we might think getting beliefs to be true is really about getting your mind. It's about direction of fit. And what you want is your mind to accurately fit the way the world is. And this is talking about getting things right and a representation of it in true. Whereas our desires and our preferences are about getting the world to fit the way we want them to be, to change, right? So there's this two-way relationship. It depends on which way we're going. When we want our mind to conform the way the world is, then we're interested in something like truth.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. Very much appreciated. My question is directed primarily to Dr. Thompson, but in true Socratic Club fashion, I would appreciate feedback from both of you. Dr. Thompson, at the end of your presentation, you made a claim that secular humanism can provide perhaps a better justification or better impetus for stewardship of the planet. And I want to challenge you on that because, at least from where I'm sitting, or standing, I suppose, Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition has a 3,000 to 4,000 year track record. Not only that, but it's also based on the concept of absolute morality, whereas secular humanism is an extremely recent very novel philosophy that's if I may say so, quite arbitrary and has no absolute moral basis. It's just based on sort of whatever morality is fashionable, and to a great extent, what morality is fashionable as a foil to the Judeo-Christian tradition, because that's basically what it was developed as, is a response to that. I don't see how secular humanism could have any possible advantage over the Judeo-Christian tradition with respect to motivating the sort of behavior that we all seem to be, hoping for as far as environmental stewardship. And I would hope that both of you could speak to that. I appreciate the presentations. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for your comment and your question. It seems your understanding of intellectual history outweighs mine, because you have very strong views on both the very deep nature of what Christianity is and what religion is and what secular human philosophies are or can reveal, that I just don't have as much confidence in as you do. I'd be interested later, perhaps, in hearing your arguments for those claims and not just the assertion of them. The second point is, I didn't offer secular humanism in the account of why we can understand ourselves to be under the obligation to be responsible stewards of the planet as an improvement, only as an alternative. The way the logic of my presentation was to be set up is that here's the Lin-White thesis. It's not as problematic for Christianity as we thought. It diverges into these different readings. And I said, then the question was, why should we think of ourselves as responsible? And the first answer was that the divine commandment can clearly answer this question, right? It has a clear, straightforward, intelligible kind of answer to this question. Can secular humanists provide an alternative? And as long as it's an intelligible alternative, the position is then you don't need the divine command. It's this question about necessity. Right? Do we have to have the story of God to have an intelligible understanding of why we have the obligation? I didn't say the secular one is better. All I need to say is it's as intelligible. Right? So that there's an alternative, and you don't have to be wed to the Judeo-Christian one. The third element I'd like to respond to is about the moment. So I think you were getting about motivation in some ways. I don't know what will in fact motivate all sorts of people. I'm pretty sure that the Judeo-Christian story alone will not motivate everybody. Similarly, the secular humanist story alone will not motivate everybody. Everybody belongs to all sorts of different camps about what's really going on and what's really true. Those are psychological questions about what's actually going to get people to get off their seats and do what needs to be done. And that takes empirical study about what sort of things will do it. And I, from the armchair, doubt that there's any one story that's enough for everybody. Thanks for the question.
Just one comment. I want to make sure that we don't that we preserve that term humanism and humanist, and not even if you're a Christian like I am, that you don't think there's something bad about being a humanist. I want to argue very strongly for a position of Christian humanism, and would argue that that within the framework of the Christian understanding, we can be most fully human. So and it seems to me that what you're arguing for in terms of secular humanism is very close to what I'm arguing for in terms of Christian humanism. There's not a lot of difference. And what we really are different on is the foundation, on what story makes the most sense of our humanity. I won't go into that argument again, but I do want to defend that term humanism.
I appreciate that.
Dr. Wilkinson, Dr. Thompson, thank you very much, both of you. Dr. Wilkinson, my question is for you. At the beginning of your speech, and again 2 answers ago, you referred to Jesus Christ. I wonder if you might help us to understand how he fits into this picture.
I'm sorry, I just didn't hear you clear enough to answer the question.
At the beginning of your speech, and again 2 questions ago, you referred to the person of Jesus Christ I wonder if you might help us to understand how he fits into this picture.
Well, again, 1 minute answer. The Christian understanding, my understanding of who Jesus is that he, certainly a first century Jew, but also was God's clearest message to us of who he is. And that in Christ we see what human beings can be in relationship to God, but also in Jesus Christ we see what God is in relationship to us. And so the classic Christian idea of Jesus as the mediator between God and man, that Jesus is God for us, but he also takes all of our humanity and offers it back in its perfection to God. And so the relevance of Jesus for this discussion is that in that loving and sacrificial life, we see all that God is, and we see all that we can be in response to God as we offer back to God. So, short answer: Jesus is God for us, and Jesus represents to God, is to God what man can be.
Hi, it's kind of along the same lines, my question. I just really needed you to elaborate. I don't have a distinct question. In that, I think you compared earlier Christ's sacrifice for us, kind of a lot similar to how we should sacrifice for the environment, and that we're caretakers. And I was confused on how you viewed that role versus you said that environment wasn't for us, we were caretakers for it. And I suppose I felt like the view would be that we were created for God, and that he wasn't sacrificing because it was his responsibility as a caretaker. And I was confused on that relationship to sacrifice versus putting the environment's needs before ourselves. That's what that sounded like. And I suppose I didn't really understand quite how that paired up.
Yeah. I'm not sure I got all the notes of your question, but I think the point I was trying to make has to do with the point you made towards the very end, and that is the nature of power. One understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God is that God is ultimately powerful, right? God is omnipotent. Therefore, human beings have power, and we are to use that power, exercise that power. What Jesus shows us about God is that power is fundamentally to be used as service, as care. Power is to be not used for the building up of oneself, but given up for the sake of others. And that pattern of sacrifice is what I was trying to describe as a kind of parallel between the sacrifice of Jesus, the self-giving love of Jesus, which is a kind of emblem for us of the self-giving love of God in creation. That should tell us something about our own attitudes towards the world. But it's the best. It should inform our the kinds of, I like the phrase ecological restoration. It's restoration not for our benefit, but for the benefit of the good of the ecosphere, the good of the ecosystems. That's a pattern that seems to me is evident in God, evident in Jesus.
Thank you to both of you on volunteer. Appreciate it. Question for Professor Thompson. You raised the question of how a secular perspective could justify the idea that one has an obligation to care for the natural world. And I jotted down three reasons. One is that we owe it to future human beings. Two is that it's better to exist than not to exist. And three is from Spider-Man that from great power comes great responsibility. And to me, to my way of thinking, those seem like assertions that rest on a theistic foundation. Or I can think, as a Christian, for reasons why I would affirm those things to be so. Could you help us understand from the secular perspective why, for example, we'd affirm that it's better to exist than not to exist, and that with great power comes great responsibility, and that we owe it to future generations to care for the world?
Sure, I can try. First, I think just for clarification, the claim that it's better to exist than not to exist was a premise that's required to explain how we can't harm future generations with this little philosophical chestnut problem about Parkinson's paradox. I outlined three possible reasons why, from not appealing to a divine creator, we might be able to justify the claim that we have something like an obligation to be responsible stewards. And it was largely, the first one was that there are intrinsically morally valuable things besides humans in the world, and we owe some sort of care to them as moral beings. The other was to say, well, it's just human beings. Maybe it's future human beings that we owe this to. And then the third, and you see both of those depend upon the moral status of some other being. That's not God, right? But just like I owe something to you, not to come over there and beat you up or whatever, you've got a right to life. I owe all sorts of things based on your moral status. The dignity that you are owed justifies constraints on me, moral constraints on me. That's you. It could be that the dog or a cow or a species of spotted owl also is a being with some sort of moral dignity that I have obligations to. I'm looking for non-theistic ones. Maybe it's future human beings that I owe it to. It seems to me that those are all non-theistic accounts of how I might have an obligation to other beings to leave them a healthy environment. Right? I owe it to them. It's a necessary condition for their well-being that they have some healthy environment. I have obligations to them. One of them might well be if I deliver to them or not harm the environment that they will depend upon for their flourishing. My proposal was a little bit something different, that there's not other moral beings that have these moral obligations too, obligations in sort of proper sense. And that's why I used quotes. But that I have a kind of, and this is the one about with great power comes great responsibility. Since we have the power, since we are by default the ones with whom the buck will stop, as it were, there's a perspective we can understand that we can do this well or we can do this badly. And it's my belief that given the contingent history of the planet and the way humanity has acted upon it, we are, just as a matter of contingent historical fact, the responsible parties for the condition of the biosphere on which all life depends. Not the basic conditions, but how it moves forward and around the parameters, right? Causing harm or conditions of flourishing to other living creatures. We can conceive of ourselves, if we have this identity as the stewards, of doing this well or doing this badly. And so my claim was that we have a kind of obligation to ourselves to step up, to be all that we can be, and to do this well. And that fundamentally being responsible in this way is a kind of good-making human character trait. So you see, that's different than an obligation to another moral being. And from my perspective, it's quite different than an obligation to a personal supernatural creator. Whether it's evolution or the creator that has made me as I am, there's a way to be an excellent me. It doesn't depend on God. And so in this way, from my perspective, it is not dependent on, as you had said, a Christian worldview.
Just a brief response. I still think that the questioner was asking for, you haven't really answered, and that is, on what basis is great power comes responsibility? Does one choose that over a sort of Nietzschean or Machiavellian position that says, if I've got the power, I could do what I want to. So
what's going to return? This is going to return to something like the question in Plato, right? because the perspective, I think that in your interpretation of this question, you're framing the very possibility of living a moral life as the universe being created by an intentional personal God, or being a total act of random molecules moving around, is to say that a moral perspective, a morally valuable perspective, is only intelligible under a framework under which there is God as a divine creator, right? And without God, everything is morally permitted, or something like that. And of course, Plato very famously engages with this problem, which I just love. You know, it's called the Euthyphro question, and it really it is a challenge to anyone who holds what I would just call a divine command theory. The divine command theory of morality says it's God's commanding something that makes it an obligation to do it. It's God's forbidding it that makes it morally impermissible to do, these sorts of things. And there's nothing else. And Plato asked Euthyphro, is some act morally right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's morally right? And we can allow perfect coextension. Everything God commands, we can allow that there's God, and that everything God commands is our moral duty, and everything God forbids is morally impermissible. Perfect coextension. We just wonder what is doing the explaining of what. And the divine command theorist has only one, favors the view that says it's God's commanding it that makes it right. God is not omniscient in the sense in seeing rightness, and is an infallible interpreter of his commands, tracking its independence somehow of God, right? That's the other option. There are problems for the theist in the divine command theory, well-known problems. For example, all of God's commands are arbitrary. In principle, there is no reason that God commands or forbids what he does, because if there was a reason, that'd be the right or wrong-making feature that we could also discover. So if there's not a reason, then his commands are arbitrary. That's a problem for a lot of theists, because that speaks of imperfection, and we start to have a problem, like the problem of evil. All of these properties of God hanging together. If God doesn't have reasons, and God might be perfect. That's sort of the problem. God could also have commanded us to rape, or rape and pillage, torture. There's no reason God commanded the things that we perceive of as good to do that. And finally, the only other feature for this is that the thesis that God is all good becomes an empty tautology. Because if God's arbitrary commands are the only source of moral goodness, then God could not fail to be good. And it becomes an empty thesis to say that God is all good, not the substantive, meaningful thesis that Christian theists want to assert. And all I mean to say is there are problems for the presumption that the only source of the moral perspective is God's, or moral reality is God's commands. There are problems with that view. I don't know what the truth is. There are other worked out traditions for answering that from the humanist philosophical orientation in John Stuart Mill, in Immanuel Kant, in Aristotle, in David Hume, to name just a few, if you want to look for examples that do not depend upon divine command. So it's perfectly intelligible to have a moral perspective without appeal to God as the determiner of human morality.
These are the last two. We'll take the last two questions, and then we'll move to our closing statements. Speakers, please, let's try and generally limit it to 1 to 2 minutes. It's all right. It's a topic we talk about for hours.
Thanks. I'm most interested in Dr. Wilkinson's answer, but I'd like to hear from both of you. Briefly, my question is just how, as responsible stewards of the environment, do you think we ought to treat animals that we intend to eat? But to expand upon that, you both brought up in your arguments like issues of moral treatment of the environment. And so with particular regard to animals, there have been some tribal hunter-gatherer cultures in our history that have had almost a religious respect for animals that they have killed for food and for skin. And so I was wondering if you thought that we've lost some sort of moral integrity with regard to that, in particular our modern culture that eats a lot of meat but also doesn't have a full grasp of meat and where it comes from and what it is. So thank you.
Well, increasingly, my wife and I try to eat and serve only meat whose origins we know. We know that the animals have been well treated. And it's fairly easy to define that. At least an animal, a cow that's on a pasture, is probably better treated than a cow that's knee-deep in its own excrement and protected from disease by antibiotics. So it seems to me we have a pretty good sense of what good treatment is and what bad treatment is, and we ought to live according to that. And that does imply some things about being more mindful, more knowledgeable about what we eat, about knowing where it comes from, how it's been raised, and so forth. I'll stop there.
I would only add, I agree completely with that insofar as we have a shared ground on humanism in the sense of good humanity, being good humans in some form or another. I like this sort of language, right, of realizing the good within us to treat other animals with far more humanity than we tend to treat them in industrial agriculture. The kind of pain and suffering we do is just below our own dignity. And we only carry it out, really, most of us, because we do not see any of that going on. We are shown false pictures of the kind of conditions that these animals live on. We like to imagine it's all a Petri farm sort of stuff, but it's not like that. And if we really do better, so I forget who said it, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we wouldn't eat the way that we eat today.
I'll direct this to Dr. Thompson, please. How can you or I or me, how can one expect a patriarchal, and by that I mean a sexist, racist, monetarist, militaristic power structure with its man-made God and in man's image? How can that be expected to have anything other than the tradition of lying, cheating, and murdering that is historically promoted? How can we expect that to result in anything other than death for the human species by starvation, pestilence, disease, and warfare?
Good question. I want to treat that with some care. It seems to me, to speak in some cliches, I guess, like Spider-Man, power corrupts. Power corrupts, and when people, regardless of their origins or ideology, come into being able to do things to promote what they perceive to be their good and the good of their friends, and get a rise over others, boy, do we do it. We take advantage of this. Men have been in a position to do this, and the rich have been in a position to do this, and wealth brings wealth, and all this sort of stuff. This seems to be more a part of humanity than characteristic of any particular ideology, whether it's a Christian worldview or not. Plenty of humans have been problematic and patriarchal to one another throughout the history of time. I guess I would just close by saying there's a lot of doctrines to Christianity. I'm no expert whatsoever, but I was brought up under the wing of a mentor early on when I was in high school as an ex-Jesuit priest, and really he told me really what it's fundamentally about. So I got a limb here, but that it's to love like Jesus loved. To love like Jesus loved is the fundamental thing that we've hit on a little bit here already. And to the extent that that's real, and that we can take that to heart, then certainly the kind of problems that plague humanity have a chance to be broken.
If you were describing the biblical God presented in the Christian story I was describing, I would say that's a terrible caricature, and it would take a lot longer to try to give my reasons for that. But I think it is, getting back to what Ellen said, the God we meet in biblical story is a God of love.
Thank you, both speakers. Will we now, and thank you, audience, for your participation. We'll now end with a short 3 to 5 minute closing statement from each speaker. Dr. Thompson, would you be willing to start us off?
Sure, I can try. I had a wonderful opportunity to articulate my view here several times in contrast with Dr. Williams, but both to compare and contrast the overlap, which are important, and the relatively mild metaphysical differences about its underpinnings. I don't need to take the whole time, it seems to me, just to retreat to the kind of view about pluralism, and I think as long as we have a conception of being responsible for the conditions of the planet, but stops with us in some way, and that we do not try to dodge that by the problems of it's only our collective activities that do this. You know, there's a very curious problem we have today about our individual moral responsibility for the conditions of the planet, because no change in your lifestyle or my lifestyle can make it particularly any real worse. Think about climate change or prevent it at all. It's only us collectively, and so it's really only through policies. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we're off the hook in our personal and our individual lifestyles. And so I suppose what I'm getting at is to keep in the forefront of your mind that part of the problem of our age is the collective impact of humans on the problem and the mysterious ties that the collectivity has to us as individuals, or the way in which we are tied to the collective. We are an indissoluble part of the whole, each and every one of us. And to know how the responsibility that lies on all of humanity trickles down and hangs on each of us is a puzzle and mystery. A lot of people can use this to excuse themselves because their acts, as individuals alone, are relatively inconsequential. But I would ask each of us to work on that puzzle and think about how we can not think about it in those terms, but that indeed what it is to be a good human being is to first see yourself as possessing an identity as the kind of thing that is responsible, is a member of the group that collectively is responsible for the basic conditions of all life on the planet. That's all.
And I think I agree with everything that Alan has said. But would add that I'm not going to persuade Alan of the truth of Christianity. I'm not going to persuade you if you aren't already persuaded. But if you are a Christian, I'm speaking specifically, especially to those of you who are, I think you do need to take very seriously that what we call the good news of God's love for creation is good news for the whole creation. It's not just good news for human beings. And that if we live in a way that is bad news for the rest of creation, we're living in a way that's inconsistent with what we claim to believe. So I say this especially to those of you who are Christians. Take seriously a text like Colossians 1:15 and following that says that the reconciliation of Christ is for everything in creation, not just for us. We've been given the privilege of working with and in that kingdom of God, which is coming through the good news of Christ, through the sacrifice of Christ. So that's what we do.
Thank you all for attending tonight's debate. The speakers and members of the Socratic Club will be around for a few minutes to answer questions. If you would like to receive email announcements of upcoming debates or are interested in joining the Socratic Club, you can sign up in the lobby. We also have free essays for you and a box where you can submit topic ideas for future debates. The Socratic Club has a library of books written by past debaters as well as many books by C.S. Lewis. It is located in the Talisman Room in the OSU Memorial Union. It is also open to the public. Don't forget to find us on Facebook as well as YouTube, where we have videos of past debates and updates on future debates. As this is the last Socratic Club debate of the year, I hope to see many of you next year at our debates. We currently are planning debates for next year, so if you have a topic idea, please please let us know by either talking to one of the Scrap Club members or submitting an idea in our topic box up front. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed the debate. And please, let's get one last round of applause for our wonderful speakers.